Welcome to today's webinar on healthcare disparities and the effects of race and racism. We have just a few housekeeping details to share before we get started. This program is being recorded, and the link for the video will be available within a few days. The recording will be shared by email and will be posted on our website, and continuing education credits will be available. When today's webinar concludes, participants may click on the evaluation link in the description below this video window to obtain continuing education credits. My name is Kevin Tucker. I'm a physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Today's session is being co-moderated by my colleague, Dr. Ajay Singh, and I will ask Dr. Singh to introduce himself.
Thank you, Kevin. My name's Ajay Singh. I'm a physician at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, nephrologist. I'm also Senior Associate Dean for Postgraduate Medical Education at Harvard Medical School, and it's my pleasure to participate in this session as a moderator.
Thank you, Ajay. One cannot talk about healthcare disparities in a meaningful way without talking about racism. Today, we're going to approach the subject of racism when it is applied to a healthcare provider. We'll also talk about the impact of racism on communities of color other than the African American community. Today, we are joining this discussion by a major leader in healthcare, Dr. Sachin Jain. Dr. Jain is a graduate of Harvard College, Harvard Medical School, and the Harvard Business School. He was a resident in internal medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital, which is where I met him. Since completing his residency training at Brigham and Women's Hospital, he has held major leadership positions in government at Merck and CareMore. He is currently the president and CEO of Scan Group and Health Plan. In 2018, he was named one of American Healthcare's 100 most influential leaders by Modern Healthcare magazine. Dr. Jain, thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much, Kevin.
So when we started thinking about this webinar series, you immediately came to mind as one of the people whom I thought we should talk to, because I remembered the essay that you had published in the Annals of Internal Medicine going back to 2013. And in that essay, you talk about an unpleasant experience that you had with a patient that highlights some of the issues about dealing with a patient who is racist. So I want you to walk us back and tell us a little bit about that experience and about your writing about it. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was January 2012. I was a senior resident in internal medicine at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I was called by my intern at the time, who said, "There's a very difficult patient who's very upset, and would you mind coming and speaking with him?" Went to the patient's bedside, asked the intern what was going on. And she said the patient's insulin wasn't necessarily available through our pharmacy. And we were planning on offering an alternate form of insulin. And the patient only wanted to use their type of insulin. And at that point, I asked the patient if they would be kind of interested in bringing in their own insulin. They continued to be upset, and the conversation escalated a bit. And at some point, the patient launched a pretty significant missile in my direction. The patient said, "Why don't you go back to India?" I'm actually from Bergen County, New Jersey. I'm of Indian origin. And it was the first time in my years as a medical student or as a resident where I'd experienced racism. I'd experienced, I would say, subtle forms of racism, but this was, basically a racial epithet kind of being hurled in my direction in a professional context. And it caught me completely off guard. I had never imagined that I would experience that, wearing a white coat, having gone to the schools I attended, being in the position I was of trying to help this individual get the insulin that they needed. And almost reflexively and regrettably on the spot, I told the patient, "Why don't they get the bleep out of the hospital?" And, I then had this, kind of crisis of confidence about kind of what I had done, how I was feeling in that particular moment. I felt like I had potentially violated some of medicine's, kind of unstated professional norms. At the same time, I was, frankly, appalled that that type of behavior not only kind of took place, and I was just one person who had experienced it, but there are countless people who had experienced those types of attacks, by patients. But I was also kind of curious about the complete lack of institutional response around the issue. I, of course, notified my attending rather at the time. We transferred the care of the patient to a different attending, to a different resident rather. Or I think what happened was that the intern actually just managed the patient directly with the attending, and I was out of the way largely. So I actually put pen to paper and wrote about this experience, and had the experience of then sending it to a number of kind of major medical journals and having it be rejected as being non-topical, irrelevant. My response didn't reflect the values of the profession. That type of thing kind of came back in the reviews. And then I give Christine Lane at Annals of Internal Medicine a lot of credit. She published the piece, I think, against the recommendation of some of the reviewers. And the paper, ended up causing a lot of controversy. I got a number of letters saying, I needed to learn a bit about how to be a doctor, that my teachers hadn't taught me how to be a doctor because I had reacted kind of negatively to, this patient in the way that I had. And to be clear, I certainly regret the response, but it was also a human response. And I think what was kind of jarring to me about some of the responses to my essay were that, professionalism was equated with stripping me of my own humanity and my own, reaction to things. Mm-hmm. And I would say the second piece of it was I got a number of responses, an overwhelming number of responses from minority physicians who are basically saying, thank you for putting into words what we experience every single day. And I heard just a number of heart-wrenching stories about medical students at Mass General, being reassigned to other patients because the patient didn't want an African-American medical student taking care of them. I heard about, physicians in Memphis, Tennessee, who, endured racism every day. And despite their pleas to, kind of medical staff leadership to do something about it, there was a desire to kind of maintain, Press-Ganey scores at high levels. And so there was a desire to kind of not necessarily address that for fear of lower patient satisfaction scores. And so I thought we have this really messed up society in which the people who are empowered to take care of others are totally unprotected from abuse. And what's been kind of really remarkable to me in the midst of everything that's been happening over the last, decade since, almost decade since that event happened, is that the conversation around this has completely shifted. And it's been heartening and it's been heartwarming because I think we're arriving now at a place where the profession in 2020 no longer accepts abuse as part of being a so-called professional. And so I think we're at an incredible inflection point, but we have a long way to go, I think, to really support healthcare workers, and I really mean healthcare workers at all levels. I mean, I think it struck me as being particularly appalling as a physician, but I can only imagine, what the patient care attendants, and the RNs who are at the bedside experience every single day, in the course of their much more intensive interactions with patients in the course of caring for them. So, I think that we have an opportunity to reset the culture of our profession. And that's why I'm really thrilled to be here with you today, in this webinar.
Can I, Kevin, just add in a couple of contributions? I think that it is really heartwarming to see someone like yourself, Sachin, who was a leader so many years ago, and it resonates today. But it's also in some ways disappointing because we still have a lot of work to do, right? I read an article in the New York Times, an op-ed published 2 days ago by Damon Tweedy, who was a psychiatrist at Duke. And I thought I'd read a passage of that because I think it's very much echoes some of what you were talking about. He says, I still vividly recall the afternoon many years ago when a patient angrily suggested that I go back to Africa and stay there, and the shrug that my white supervisor offered when I told him what happened. He goes on to say, nor will I forget the moments I saw Black patients' intelligence, motivation, and truthfulness derisively questioned. And later in his article, he says, racial health disparities can't change until the health system changes itself. And so I wanted to ask you, how, as you think about this arc from the time you published this article in the Annals to today, what is your feeling about how health systems are adapting to this, and to what degree do you think that adaptation should go? How deep should the change be in order for it to have people like yourself, a medical student at that time, or Damon Tweedy now, be satisfied that change has truly happened?
Yeah, and for the listening audience, I would really strongly recommend Damon Tweedy's book, Black Man in a White Coat, which I think so eloquently captures the experience of being, an African American, medical student and trainee in the U.S. healthcare system, particularly in the South. He does an incredible job. I would say, where we as a healthcare system have to go is we can't. We have a tendency in medicine to try to make everything our responsibility. Patients don't have housing, we're going to fix their housing problems. Patients are racist, we're going to make them not racist. We can't go quite that far. But what we can do is ensure that we support the right things happening within the walls of the institutions that we lead. And that means that we have just hiring practices. It means that when incidents do happen, and they're going to happen, for the foreseeable future, that there's appropriate institutional response, that, we ultimately stand behind people who are victims of racism, whether they're patients or clinicians. And I think what I think has ultimately happened is, in our profession, we've kind of accepted for years that the patient is always right. It's kind of part of the hidden curriculum in medical schools, that the patient is always right. And in some ways, if the patient is wrong, it's our job to kind of just stand apart from them and judge them a little bit for being wrong. We have to kind of adopt a much more, I would say, social justice model of conduct for both staff as well as for patients, so that we can have those respectful interactions that I think are the foundation of great clinical care. And I think it comes not just from kind of the right words on the wall, because we've had the right words on the wall for years. I think it comes from true institutional activism and action around these types of behaviors. So I would say since 2012, a number of institutions have now published policies on how to manage incidents of bias and racial discrimination, both from patients as well as on a staff perspective. But where I see the translation gap is how it's actually translating into leadership actions and behaviors. We have lots of carefully worded statements that are authored by expensive PR firms about how institutions are standing behind their communities and institutions are standing behind their patients. But where we see a gap is really around tangible, meaningful action that really moves the needle. And I think we have to start to hold organizations to a much higher standard around what they do. Institutions in the medical profession, these are social justice institutions, whether we want them to be or not. We're distributing social goods to people who need them. We have to do so in a way that is free of racial bias, both for the people who are delivering them as well as for the patients who are receiving them.
Sachin, I want to go back to something that you said earlier, which kind of struck a chord with me. So here you are, someone who's reached the pinnacles of education, Harvard College, Harvard Medical School, Harvard Business School, and now you're a resident at Brigham and Women's Hospital. But it doesn't matter to the patient. You are still a person of color. It kind of reminds me of the situation that particularly African-American men have experienced with police, that you can be Professor Skip Gates and still be suspected of being someone who is breaking into his own home. So, one of the things that I think is really tough is that we're, telling our young men of color, strive, get a good education, and that will get you somewhere. But then even when someone like you, who's achieved all of those milestones, still faces the kind of blatant racism, that really makes you pause.
And Kevin, it continues beyond. I would say it continued beyond my time as a trainee. I mean, even as a senior executive in a Fortune 50 company, you sit in rooms where people say things that will make your jaw drop about other people, about them, about your own background, and my parents, I would say, have kind of always taught me to speak up. I mean, it might be just part of their upbringing in kind of independence era India, where social resistance was just part of kind of the public ethic. But I think we all have to speak up. Things aren't going to get better until you speak up. That was part of what motivated my writing the piece, which was to try to, and frankly, I'm embarrassed on behalf of her profession that I was the first person to really write about this topic in a major medical journal. And mind you, it was not that long ago, right? It was 2013 that it was published. So, my point is that we always have to speak up. We have to speak up until these problems go away. I think that's what you learned from Dr. King. I think it's what you learned from Gandhi. Staying silent is not the answer. And I think part of the institutional code, that people like Damon and myself have kind of grown up with, that we're running up against, is to not speak up. To be a good team player, you have to kind of accept things as they are, as opposed to going against the grain. And when I think, when people ask me what's the biggest need, what are the biggest opportunities to improve American healthcare, that's been the topic that I've been obsessed with my whole life. I've stopped saying things like new payment models, new delivery models. I've started saying things like we need better leaders, because what I see all around me is instances where people who should have courage don't have courage, and people who should be speaking up don't speak up. And so to me, that is our number one deficiency as far as driving towards the healthcare system that we need, one that is fair, equitable, safe, is actually the lack of leadership around doing what we know is true. We get taught in academic medicine that we need to study things to understand what works and what doesn't work. And I can tell you lots of things that we know work are not deployed, the way that they should be, largely because we don't have leaders who stand behind them. And so that's what I think is the missing ingredient. That's what I think medical schools should be focused on, is actually producing leaders who have the courage of their convictions to speak up and to stand out, and not necessarily fit in the way that they've been socialized to fit in.
Can I just focus a little bit on this topic of leadership? I have a colleague who's a professor at Harvard Business School who teaches leadership. And he says, and I asked him, I said, it's remarkable how few leaders of Fortune 500 companies have actually taken a stand on these type of issues. And he said to me, it's not because we haven't taught them that it's important to do that in business school. It's because the culture in these companies precludes the ability for leaders just to take that risk. So my question to you is it truly the fact that these leaders don't know what the right thing to do is, or is it because the culture around them precludes them to be able to do it? And to what degree? And so that gap is what courage is, right?
Precisely. So I reject the professor's formulation, because part of our job as leaders is to change the culture around us and not to accept it as is. And so, I mean, what you're talking about is some pretty weak-willed stuff, to be very, honest. And you can tell me afterwards who the professor was. But I truly believe that our job is to shape the environment. And I think many of us who've tried to change things, recognize that it's not a journey of a day, a week. Sometimes it's writing something in 2013 that then gets talked about, 7 years later, when the environment allows it, to be spoken of. We talked about that in the context of Damon, who I think, is rising to new heights in terms of his leadership on these topics, because of the work he did before. And so, I do think that there's a fit between ideas and time, right? And what you're seeing now is a convergence between, the social unrest that we're experiencing nationally and, some ideas that people have expressed previously. But I think it's our job to kind of consistently convey these ideas so as to create the momentum in the external environment to where the conditions will arrive at, a higher level. So I reject, all due respect to my former professors, I reject that notion.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was saying that they teach them this. It's the environment, the corporate environment that, boards and others who say, don't rock the boat, and what you're saying is that really, if you want to be considered a leader, if you are a leader, you've got to be courageous. Courage comes is a key ingredient to leadership. Is it not?
And it's painful, and it comes with a lot of bumps and bruises. I mean, if you want to create real change, it's not going to be a straight line. And I think that many people assume it's going to be a straight line, and when they realize that there's going to be personal cost and sacrifice to speaking up, to speaking out, to standing behind people who others aren't standing behind, then they walk away from the challenge. And they say, oh, the environment doesn't necessarily support me doing this. And I would say I've been fortunate to be around a lot of leaders who I think have taken on the charge. I used to work at Merck. Ken Frazier, CEO of Merck, has been, I think, highly visible and vocal around these types of issues over the last several months. And so I think there's opportunities for people to be leaders. Now, one of the things I think that's most awkward, frankly, is for people who aren't, minorities to then, speak up in a powerful and meaningful way. I think there's this question of, is it my place? Is it my responsibility? Can I speak authentically about these issues? But I think when we look deep inside our hearts, we all know, we've all, regardless of our race, our color, we've all felt excluded. We've all felt like, we've been invited to the party, but we haven't been asked to dance. And so, I think the opportunity for us is to now empower people who traditionally have not felt comfortable speaking up and speaking out with the words and with the permission. And so that's, and that sometimes means empowering Caucasian people to speak up on behalf of other types of people. And that's often a very risky kind of notion. But again, I think that's where we are. That's what's needed more than anything. And, I've just been so encouraged by how many new folks over the last several years have taken on this mantle, many unexpected. And I think the question is can we have more? Because that's what's going to create the social change. That's what's going to create the norms that we need to create for the workplace to be safe, both for patients as well as the people who are delivering the care.
Thank you. So, Sachin, I want to frame the issue of what we're doing in our organizations to address some of the issues in terms of healthcare disparities. But let's set the stage first. You were in Boston for a long time. You shared with me your senior thesis, which looked at some particular social issues and racial issues here in the city of Boston. If we look at cities like Boston, which have some of the most storied academic and medical institutions, and yet we look at who is working in those institutions, we see right there a giant set of disparities. Just this past week, the Boston Globe highlighted the story about a food service worker at one of the Boston area hospitals who was the first healthcare worker to die of COVID, which she probably acquired in the community, because where the environmental services workers and the food services workers lived were neighborhoods that were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. So those workers are predominantly immigrant, predominantly people of color, predominantly people who are living in neighborhoods that suffer from high rates of poverty and other social disparities. At the same time, the physicians, the nurses, and the administration and executives live in a different set of neighborhoods where resources are much more plenty, where health outcomes are better. So if our institutions in and of themselves have such disparities in representation, how do we as institutions begin to address some of the healthcare disparities when we have such striking disparities within our own organizations?
Yeah, I hate to be a broken record, but I think it goes back to leadership. And I think, the Brigham where, we both worked, where I trained, I think, Gary Gottlieb, I thought was actually did an outstanding job when I was there, actually speaking on behalf of underserved communities and actually, trying to build connections and clinical presence in those communities. But I also think it's about representation and leadership. This is something I'm thinking about a lot as, I now lead, SCAN group and health plan. We have to reflect the communities that we serve. If we don't have people in leadership who come from the communities that we serve and come from the communities that are representative of the broader staff that populate our community, we will have massive blind spots. I don't think people in leadership in organizations are actively looking to not care or be concerned about underserved people or staff members who come from communities that tend to be underserved. But I think they may not think about them because they may not know about them. I'm not shy to say I had a very privileged background, but what I will say is, over the years I had a number of experiences that gave me exposures to kind of backgrounds that were unlike my own. My senior thesis being, a significant one where I really got deep into, the politics of the ministry in the African American community and the politics of police and community relations during the 90s and early 2000s. That gave me a different sensitivity to some of the issues that I think, we're talking about today. I think that type of learning should be part of the curricula when you become a leader of organizations like SCAN, like the Brigham, where, you ultimately have to understand that you're not, just a service provider, right? You are a pillar in the community. You are an employer. And as part of the employer, you have to take care of your employees. And again, I think the service mission of healthcare organizations does not stop with the patients. I think that's part of what you're saying here. Mm-hmm. It actually extends to the people who work within these organizations. And that's a very different view of leadership. It's a very different view of how you operate an organization. And really great organizations, have as part of their ethos that they take care of their employees. And when you go from a really great organization to a not really great organization, you realize that's the difference, usually, most of the time, is how concerned leadership is with their employees and how deep that concern runs. So I think that, part of leadership in healthcare in 2020 is understanding the demographics of the community that you serve, not at a surface level, not from just a data perspective, but actually getting on the ground, meeting leaders, meeting community people, understanding what their issues are, because that's going to then allow you to build solutions. Maybe the answer, for the Brigham would have been, let's build better transportation infrastructure for our employees. And maybe they did that. I'm not even sure. When you're thinking about, some of the patients, some of the people who work in the community and how we can protect them. But again, you only know to think about that when you understand that maybe the T doesn't run so deep into certain parts of, Mattapan or Roxbury. So I think those are the kinds of things that I think we have to become more acutely aware of as leaders. And it's not easy. I mean, it's not easy to be thinking about everything all at the same time. But I also think that that's what we're empowered to do.
Can I turn to another sort of related topic? In an op-ed piece published in Scientific American, Joe Saccharin, who's a trauma physician at Hopkins, and a number of other colleagues, talk about, they frame their recommendations in the context of examples of implicit bias, but then they talk about specific steps that institutions and states within the United States should take. And basically they recommended in that article institutionalization of implicit bias training. The idea that, before you get certified as a physician, you have to go through an implicit bias training course. That these implicit bias, we get trained, as you know, nowadays through HealthStream videos on everything, including universal precautions and how to deal with various alarms and other types of warnings that occur through the communication system. But I haven't. But what they're arguing is that really implicit bias training should become widespread in healthcare institutions as a way to change the culture. So yes.
Yeah, I mean, educators, this is one of those classic examples of where kind of, if you're an educator, you're going to want to, your solution is going to be to educate. And I think you need more of that. So I'm not going to kind of disagree that training certainly has a place, but I think it starts again with leadership actions and leadership behaviors. My experience kind of working across multiple organizations now over the course of my career is that the tone is always set at the top. And, what is valued is always set at the top and magically somehow cascades right down to the very bottom of organizational charts. And so, again, I think you can kind of send a lot of trainings out, but I think it's also a question of what you value, who you value, how you speak, how you respond to incidents is a big deal. It's a really, really big deal. Because I think it sends us a signal and a message that's far more profound than anything else. And so, great, do more training. But one of my observations, kind of working in medical education earlier in my career, is that there are an unlimited number of topics for which you can train people, for which we are undertrained. But where I think you can create the biggest bang for your buck in terms of creating real social momentum and change is around actually setting the right values, having the right kinds of conversations, leading with integrity. And, we don't do that very much. I mean, that's the honest truth. We do, what you said about kind of the Harvard Business School's professors' observation. Yes, we teach people these things, but then they don't actually do them. That courage gap is what we need to close. And again, it goes back to what we as a society value, who we honor. Think about the example of Colin Kaepernick, right? Who sacrificed tens of millions of dollars to do what he thought was the right thing. And now look at the kind of complete about face that has taken place. What is the equivalent in medicine? What's the equivalent kind of position that we need to take in medicine that would be unpopular, that would draw sneers and jeers, that would potentially make us, risk our leadership positions and our professorships or whatever it is to really stand up for the right thing? That's the question that we ought to be asking ourselves, as opposed to, I think, kind of thinking about the next health stream video that we need to be kind of putting on the web.
Sachin, I think those are great points, and I think the issue about implicit bias is an important one. Those biases extend not just to how people look or where they come from, but I think also to educational backgrounds. We were discussing 2 weeks ago in the inaugural webinar series that it is still true in 2020 that the majority of, and maybe up to 80% of African-American physicians in the United States have been trained at Meharry, Howard, Morehouse, and Drew. And if our biases exclude people from those institutions, we're going to be excluding a whole lot of talent. If our biases exclude us from looking at people who've been educated at historically Black colleges and universities, we're going to be excluding a whole lot of talent. And so I think that our biases have to extend in many different ways, including to thinking about educational backgrounds.
No, and I think that's a really, really good point. But they also need to go back to kind of the coded language that I think is used to express those biases. I know of a full professor at Harvard who was kind of up for 2 different positions within the Boston area, who in 2 different searches was told that the committee was concerned that he was very well spoken. And the 2 of us kind of pondered for weeks and months, and we still talk about, what did it mean when they said that he was too well-spoken or too well-spoken? This was a minority physician up for pretty significant posts, And, a committee of really erudite folks said, and my question is, if that's happening at the very highest levels, what's happening at the lower levels? What is the tone being set from the top around inclusion, around diversity, and around, what was in this case clearly kind of an implicit bias that was expressed around some attribute, about being well spoken. So again, there's this is what we then subsequently learned. It's a well-known trope, to kind of put someone down if they come from a different kind of background. So I think we have to actually, I would say it's more than just training, to be very honest with you. I think we should be talking about what these tropes are, how they present themselves, how they show up commonly in our environment, and then be explicit about calling them out when they do happen. I kind of keep focusing on institutional response because I think training will ultimately be great. Policy statements will be great, but it's actually what happens when you fall outside of the lines that I think is going to be most instructive to people, not kind of the positive and affirmative statements that we put out.
Yeah, you reminded me of the old backhanded compliment of saying to an African American person, "Oh, you're so articulate."
That's the trope. That's exactly the trope, right? You're so articulate, and you're so well spoken. They're exactly version. They're different version. I think so. But that's happening in search committees in and around Boston right now, today, in 2020. What is it going to take? It's going to take leadership. It's going to take examples being made. It's going to take uncomfortable conversations. It's going to take, it's going to take asking people in open forums if they're being racist. I mean, I hate to be that, kind of abrasive about it. But I can tell you, I recently had an experience, with a sports instructor. I, play some sports on the weekends, where the sports instructor, made a comment about monkeys taking over the community. And I actually had to pause and say, what do you mean by that? Are you a racist? Again, I would say, how many of those kinds of comments go unchallenged every day? That's something we all have within our power. Every single one of us has within our power to actually challenge in the moment. And usually they're not as explicit as that. But I will tell you, I gave you an example of where I did speak up. There's an example where I didn't speak up that I'm still kicking myself over, which is, there was a group of management consultants at a company where I worked. They came from McKinsey, all very well spoken. Many of them were Indian American. Many of them were Indian. And one of the clients, one of my peers asked another, what do you think of these consultants? And the other says, oh, I can't, they all have accents. I can't really understand anything that they're saying. And I can tell you, this was a very, very articulate group of consultants. So this was a smear, it was a smear. And I reported it to HR because it made me feel uncomfortable. But I didn't challenge the person on the spot. And I regret it to this day. And to be fair, I'm not sure that they actually, I'm not sure what they meant by it. So I needed to approach it with, some level of curiosity. But the reality is that type of subtle insinuation, subtle undermining, is what people like my dad experienced when they came here and practiced medicine in the 70s and 80s. I think about how many jobs, how many opportunities. I think he was fortunate. He had some tremendous mentors. Many of us were fortunate to have tremendous mentors. But for the predominance of Indian Americans in the medical profession, when you look at how few are actually in real leadership positions, deans of medical schools, presidents and CEOs of hospitals, whatever it is, again, I think we've been a privileged minority. But the point is, I think that there are ceilings that exist for people that we're not even acknowledging as ceilings. And so again, we have to be asking these questions. We have to be challenging ourselves about why things aren't different. Because I think there's people who ask. There's a lot of good kind of leaders, and they're largely seen as outcasts within other professions, honestly, because they do ask the hard questions that no one wants to ask. But we need to kind of grow and develop more of those within medicine. I don't think they exist in the numbers that they should.
Can I ask Sachin, how much? I mean, I think the current debates about this are very, very promising, right? Because of I think that for the first time, I think many of us sense that the needle has shifted, such that people actually think that that change needs to happen. The Black Lives Movement has actually resonated with people who are not Black and who are not minorities. It's resonated with many young people. If you look at the protests that were happening in Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C., there were a lot of non-Blacks and non-minorities who were there. A lot of white people there, young people. It's resonated with them. So there's progress. But
Ajay, I think, just to interrupt, sorry to interrupt, but I think that that's progress because there was this video that just showed this horrific and horrible act that was incontrovertible, right? Even, you don't need to be a physician to recognize that putting your knee on someone's neck is bad for them. And so but the question I think we have to ask ourselves is where should we have cameras that we don't have right now? What are the recordings that we're not making that we ought to be making, that we ought to be putting out there, that we're all experiencing? The microaggressions, the subtle commentary, that ultimately, are feeding into, I think, decision making that is fundamentally unjust. I just think we need more cameras in more places, and we need to bring this stuff to light more. Sorry to interrupt you, but
no. I think you're saying it correct. Clearly, we need more, but I think there are hopeful voices out there. It is a very challenging time to have this national conversation because we're not getting the national leadership in these areas that we need. But then if you shift the lens towards healthcare, I think your point is a very valid one, that in order for us to make changes, we need more than privileged minorities. We need a larger number of people to be role models. And while there's been a lot of success among Indian Americans, perhaps, in getting to some of these leadership positions, I would say among Black Americans, it hasn't been as good. I mean, Black Americans make four times the population of Indian Americans, and yet they don't have the same sort of leadership success in leading, being presidents of major organizations.
So that's what we have to do, is we have to actually, we actually have to take some decisions and put some people in those places. And by and large, when we do that, everyone succeeds. I mean, that's just the honest truth. And so I think we have to kind of push for that. So when we sit on search committees, rather than kind of, I think, reviewing the minority candidates and saying this is a great person, but so-and-so is so far and above the other, we have to say, actually, as an organization, as an institution, we have to make a statement and we have to change the culture. And that's far more important right now than getting the person who's, ready day one for the job because they've done the job somewhere else. That's a very different kind of conversation. I mean, I don't know much about the circumstances about it, but I was so pleased when I heard there's, an African physician who's appointed to be the chair of, the anesthesia department at Mass General, I think before the age of 40. That was an institution, with tremendous research accomplishments, but still kind of relatively early in their career. That's the kind of thing, those are the kinds of groundbreaking kind of changes that then start to, I think, catapult changes in culture. And so you could, anyone could look at, that gentleman's CV and say, he's got 100 fewer papers than so-and-so. But again, if they've got the talent, they've got the capability, they've got the vision. Again, organizations need to take those kind of calculated risks to then transform and change culture. That's the stuff that isn't happening enough. And so again, there's lots of hopeful talk, but I'm eager to see more hopeful action, like those types of leadership appointments. Harvard University, has had three president searches during four, essentially during my kind of affiliation with the university. At no point, I think, was there a serious African-American candidate who's a finalist for that position ever. what does that say about the institution, right? What does it say about what the institution values? You can't comment about it. You're employed by the institution. But as an alumnus, as a member of the Alumni Association, an elected member of the Alumni Association Board of Directors, I can ask that question. And we all have to use our platforms to ask those questions. Because if we don't ask those questions, no one will. That's the interesting thing, right? No one will ask those questions if we're not asking those questions. And it's uncomfortable to ask those questions. It's challenging to ask those questions. It's self-sacrificing to ask those questions. It's self-compromising to ask those questions. But those are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking, even if it makes us uncomfortable because, we think so-and-so is is a great candidate because they've been a president somewhere else. We have to ask those questions.
So you said a key word, and that is uncomfortable, because when you were talking about speaking out about situations that arise, I think we all have situations where we wish, looking back, that we had spoken out about something that was not right. But it makes us uncomfortable. And I think that, going back to your essay, you talked about how what happened to you was a trigger to, being a little boy on the playground. And it takes us all back to when we were kids, and many of us as people of color who were thrust into largely white environments in school. And we wanted to assimilate. We wanted to make friends and be a part of the dominant culture. And so I think we often would suppress, what we felt and should have spoken up because we want to be assimilate and want to be liked and have friends.
You're right.
And I think that's the constant struggle that we all face.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. I will say the only thing I'll just say in response is that the only way to get comfortable with confrontation is to do it. I mean, it gets easier the more you do it, honestly. But it's a muscle that, like any other, that needs to be developed. And again, stylistically, it doesn't have to be, kind of, we're raising the rafters. And again, this is part of developing the muscle. I think earlier in my career, I was probably far more abrasive in kind of presenting my viewpoint. I would say I'm still abrasive presenting my viewpoint, but I'm occasionally more tactful. And again, I think these are skills we ought to develop. Is how do we engage in courageous confrontation that where we're asking the right questions, where we're challenging, the notion that, we're challenging who gets selected for a position. We're challenging the composition of the medical school class at Harvard Medical School. What would it take for a group of Harvard Medical School professors to, transform the way the admissions committee thinks about admitting students? I know that, these are very traditional institutions where change is extremely hard. They are that way by design. But then the question is like, if not us, then who? If not now, then when, right? These are the questions we always have to ask ourselves. And again, the beauty of kind of being established and having tenure and having all these degrees and having all these positions and working in a profession where you could go across the street and work somewhere else tomorrow is using it, right? Using that currency that we have to actually try to create some positive change and momentum in the universe.
Can I ask you, just shift focus a little bit to another topic, and that is related. We consider ourselves the healing profession, and there's a lot out there that's currently broken with respect to racial strife. How do you feel about physicians, people in the healthcare profession speaking out? There's been some recent criticism about people who take strong, strident views politically, who are from the medical profession, as this is not part of our profession. This is not professional. What are your thoughts about that? Do you think that we should speak out about this on these issues? Do you think we should feel that because healing is part of our profession, right?
Yeah, and the truth is that the history of physician activists, is a long one. I mean, you had Physicians for Human Rights. You've had, physicians who oppose, nuclear proliferation. I think there's a Nobel Prize awarded for that. So, I think the notion that physicians should not participate in social activism is an outdated one. It's a quaint one. It's held onto by a number of folks, for reasons that I can't, begin to fathom or articulate. But as physicians, we are highly educated. We have, I think, one of the most beautiful things about our profession is it does give us into a window into the lives of so many people, and gives us a deeper understanding of the human condition, I think, than many others are able to experience through other professions. And so I think it creates some leadership obligations, that, and some opportunities. So, my view is that we should be using the platforms that we have to speak up and to speak out. Again, it's uncomfortable. And I think that there's organizations that don't value it. But I think of people like, Esther Chu, who I think, has over the last number of years, an emergency room physician, for those of you who are not familiar with her, at Oregon Health Sciences University. I think she's always been a bit outspoken. I think she's a really good example of, a physician who's actually used their platform to try to change dialogue, and to build momentum. And she's taken a lot of bullets and a lot of arrows from a lot of different directions. People have called her unprofessional and much worse, frankly. But I think, again, history will be on her side. History will be on the side of people who take stances, and are on the side of social justice. But anybody who's ever done that, has never, if you kind of study Dr. King's life or Malcolm X's life, these were tortured souls. so I don't recommend it to everybody, right? It's not, this isn't the work for everybody. But it is, but if we do want to speak out against it and we do want to create social change, I would argue that, publication is one way to do it, but actually speaking out in your own organization in many cases is a far more powerful one, because over time, if we are on the side of justice, if we are on the side of equality, if we are on the side of creating opportunity for all, those are values that win in the end. So I think that, again, I don't recommend it. I think people have to put on their armor. I think they've got to get comfortable. They've got to develop thick skin. They've got to get comfortable getting hate mail from people who, think that you're not a professional, you're not a good professional, you weren't trained well because you spoke to a patient in a particular way. But at the end of the day, we all have an obligation, I think, to shine a flashlight on the injustice that exists around us. I think that's part of that's what being a professional in 2020 really means.
Yeah, it strikes me, for example, that, the COVID-19 pandemic has killed nearly 150,000 people and probably impacted the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, more than that, beyond that, because of the morbidity that this illness can actually lead to, whether it's in older people or even in younger people. But then it impacts minorities, particularly Blacks, at a twofold higher rate, if not more, than anyone else. And that, while that fact is known fairly widely, I haven't seen enough of how that can be addressed, right? I mean, what are the programs that are being done out there to mitigate that impact? And we as leaders in healthcare have a responsibility, as you correctly pointed out, to take the courageous steps, to step out of our comfort zone, to take risk. But we do but people do it. It's not for everyone. And then when you see how Tony Fauci has been dealt with in the media, it does make people fearful, and that there isn't psychological safety to do this. So I think it's a complicated issue. But to your point, you're never going to get anywhere if you just sit where you are.
Here's the thing: is if you're in the healing professions, or if you're a physician and you're at the top institutions in the world, and you're in the top 5% of earners in the country, and you can't speak up and you won't speak up, who will? That's what I always keep going back to is, if not us, then who? Like, who is in a better position to kind of speak up safely than people, in medicine and the healing professions? I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know where that leadership is otherwise going to come from. Your point about disparities, and COVID-19, I think COVID-19 is a stress test on the U.S. healthcare system, and is revealing how fractured our public health infrastructure is, and the profound disparities that exist from a public health infrastructure perspective and an opportunity perspective for minority communities. And so, I'm hopeful that there will be the work done over the next, number of years, to actually begin to correct some of the uneven distribution of medical care, uneven distribution of public health resources. Public health has been underinvested in for decades in this country. We're now seeing the results of that, right? I mean, that's a bit of what we're kind of understanding. But I think the outrage is what you're missing. I think that's what you're talking about, is where's the outrage around what's happening? And I think it's going to be a coalition of journalists, physicians, scientists, health services researchers who are going to bring these things to the fore. But I think we get my final, kind of argument on this point is, I think we get too comfortable with like publication as being the only means of kind of trying to create social change. It's what we're socialized to do. It's what we're taught to do. It's what I did. I experienced this bad thing. Let's write about it and publish about it and see if the world changes. I think we have to think about other modes of creating change. But it all starts with the little things we do every single day, and the values we express and the decisions we make.
So Sachin and Ajay, we're coming on close to the hour, so I want to pause there and say thank you for a very thoughtful and insightful discussion. I mean, you've given us all so much to think about, and I know that you have a very busy work life, so we want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. And I'm sure, in light of everything that's going on, you're receiving lots of requests to talk about your paper. So I'm so glad that you could take the time to talk to us today.
It's an honor. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the discussion. Really, really appreciate it.
So as a closing reminder, attendees may gain continuing education credits for participating in today's session. To do so, please click on the link in the description below this video window to complete the evaluation and obtain the credits. This information will also be distributed through a separate email to today's participants, along with links to a recorded version of today's discussion and credit information. The email will also include additional HMS COVID-19 resources. Please join us next week when my guests will be Dr. Lenny Lopez from the University of California at San Francisco and Dr. Amaka Inyanya from the University of Pennsylvania. We'll be talking about the use of race in cardiovascular disease and in kidney disease. I think it will be very enlightening and controversial discussion. So please join us. And again, thank you, Sachin. Thank you, Ajay, for joining us today.